everyone. It's a pleasure to see all your faces this morning. I'm actually very excited for this talk. I think if you've been following the news, obviously COVID has been devastating all our lives, but also had a massive, huge economic impact that's going to impact people's lives, mental health, well-being, family relationships for a good number of years to come. Luckily, we have a speaker here who's going to kind of address the faith and economic mix of our current post-COVID marketplace. Obviously, Max from RZIM, he was born in Sri Lanka, but moved to Australia as a refugee, and that's where he got his schooling. That's where he went to law school, was working in policy for a number of years, and then went to Oxford with his wife, I believe, Fiona, who is an Australian. They have 2 children. The funny thing about Max's family that I just found out, that every single member of their family is born in a different country. He was born in Sri Lanka. His wife, Fiona, is born in Australia. His son, Zach, is born in the UK. He's 3 years old. And then his youngest daughter, or his daughter who's the youngest in the family, is born in Singapore. So that is something that you don't see every day. And I imagine their passport is well stamped, and I appreciate that element of him. But he's worked in politics for a number of years. He's worked in law for a number of years, and working in policies that correlates to giving him the credentials and the ability to speak on these issues. So without further ado, Max, would you please take it away?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jesus. You guys all hear me okay? That sound's coming through. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for being so flexible to not make me begin my talk at midnight in Singapore. I know you have friends and colleagues who aren't able to make it because of the time change, so I fully appreciate that. But really, really blessed and privileged to be able to share with you guys. It's been a while since I worked in politics. I was a staffer for 7 years in Australia, and had the pleasure of working for a cabinet minister there for a while, and then with 2 prime ministers in their offices. And then we lost an election, so I lost my job, and then went to work for the leader of the opposition. So I know how that feels, where I understand most, if not all of you, are working from at the moment. And then went to Oxford for my postgrad studies. So I miss politics a lot, and even just in preparing this talk for you guys, and even just seeing you all there, I'm just a little bit jealous of the rat race and the drama and all of the fun of contested professional politics. But one thing I remember very well from when I started off in politics, when I was just a junior political advisor doing a little bit of speech writing, we had won an election that we weren't expected to win. And so I got this job, which I shouldn't have had. I was well out of my depth, even at that junior level. But my friends and I, we were in our early 20s, and we were all just fully addicted to the West Wing at that time. And that's when it was kind of running live, right? So there were literally new episodes coming out. And so, we were just less attractive, less intelligent, less articulate versions of West Wing characters, or so we told ourselves. And one thing I remember very clearly when I was kind of writing speeches and briefing our ministers is that on Jed Bartlett's desk in the West Wing, and we know that Aaron Sorkin, the writer of the West Wing, he took about 15 different American presidents and squished them together to make this fictional president, Josiah Bartlet. And one thing that he took from JFK was just a little plaque that sat on JFK's desk. And it was just there for all 7 seasons of the West Wing. And I think that plaque got made more famous because of the West Wing than because of JFK. And the plaque said, "The sea is so big, but my boat is so small. The sea is so big, but my boat is so small." And that always struck me as quite a powerful and humble thing for, arguably the most powerful office holder on the planet, to have that on their desk, that even for him or her, whoever sits in that chair, even the presidency of the United States, holding all that power, it's still, if that office holder is honest with themselves, the sea does still seem very big, and it can get very, very stormy. and our boats can seem very small. And in the last 10 months, the pandemic has really kind of epitomized that reality, I think, regardless of who we are, where we work, how financially secure we might have been, how emotionally strong and resilient we might have been, how popular we were, how comfortable we were in our lives. It's felt like a very big stormy sea out there, a big stormy ocean, and our boats have felt increasingly insignificant, increasingly vulnerable, and increasingly under threat in various ways. And so with that in mind, and with all of that kind of uncertainty swirling around as if it's a storm, I wanted to share with you some things that I believe to be crucial to our capacity as people of faith, but also as policy thinkers, as actualizers of public policy, as participators in political and public discourse at the highest levels, things that we need to get right and do well with a renewed commitment and a renewed sense of focus if we are to properly understand the COVID and the post-COVID marketplace. And everything I'm going to say is going to apply to two different categories of marketplace, because that word marketplace is a bit of a strange word. Like, what can that actually mean? Well, I'm talking about two marketplaces. One is the external marketplace, and the other is the internal marketplace. So the external marketplace, the economy, the world of public policy in which so many of you guys are working, of politics, of geopolitics, of political discourse, of debate. The external world, our economies, our employment situations, our health and medical situations, and how we're getting through that as a society and as a global community of societies. The external marketplace, but also the internal marketplace, the marketplace of the human heart, the supply-demand feedback loop that's happening with every single human heart, and what those desires actually are, which actually hasn't changed at all with the pandemic. So the external marketplace is changing and has changed significantly, but the internal marketplace remains exactly as it always done. What are people looking for? What are the desires of the human heart? The very same things they have always been. People desiring relationship, acceptance, significance, meaning, purpose, fulfillment, flourishing. These aren't Christian things. These are human yearnings of every single human heart that's out there. And so to understand the marketplace out there and to understand the marketplace in here, I want to share with you three things that we need to be doing intentionally, thoughtfully, and in my view, better. And those are these. We need to work out again and afresh in this post-COVID world how we are going to navigate instability, how we are going to rethink independence, and how we are going to deal with suffering. How we're going to navigate instability, how we're going to rethink independence, and how we're going to deal with suffering. And that applies very much to each of us as individuals and in our families, in our workplaces, in our friendship groups. But it also applies in a much broader sense to our societies and our communities. For you guys, to the nation of Canada, to every single province, to every sector of the economy, both micro and macro, and to the global community as well, right? Navigating instability, rethinking independence, and dealing with suffering. So navigating instability, for each of these three things, there is a prevailing cultural narrative. There is a prevailing cultural paradigm that is out there that is really a marker of modernity. It's not so much a left-wing, right-wing thing. It's just a marker of, the modern project, if you like, that's really taken off in so many different ways since the end of the Second World War. And we can track it back to the third stage of the Industrial Revolution, followed by the communications and computing revolution, now shifting into the virtual and augmented reality and artificial intelligence revolutions. But they're all kind of working together to form this thing called the modern project, if you like, or modernity, as political scientists and sociologists say. And the prevailing cultural paradigm in the context of navigating through instability is to find a way to predict the instability, to predict and understand the instability. That's what the world tells us. And in every academic discipline, whether it's economics or political science or medicine or engineering, what we are trained to do is to use models and bodies of knowledge and systems of evaluation to work out what is going to happen and how to respond to that. And by and large, that's actually a pretty rational and sensible way to do things. And, for the most part, it actually works quite well. The problem is that in the last 8 months especially, and certainly going forward, all of these systems of stability and these predictive models that we have been using are becoming less and less effective. They're becoming less and less effective because the systems on which we have built our sense of stability have become increasingly volatile. And I'm talking about the systems of global trade, the systems of global economics, our supply chains, our political discourse, the nature of identity politics, the increasingly ad hominem attacks of actually going after individuals rather than deconstructing and debating ideas. All of this is a marker of growing instability. The storm, we talk about our boat being so small and the storm being so big. This is all part of that. There was a North American sociologist called George Ritzer, and he talked about this term McDonaldsization. McDonaldsization. And of course, he's referring to the fast food outlet, but he was actually using it to refer to a much broader set of phenomena culturally and psychologically. And his point was, since McDonald's became McDonald's, 1950s, 1960s, we have been shifting to a place where people want things quickly, they want them on demand, and they want to know what they are getting with consistency and regularity. And he identified 4 characteristics of modernity that he said made up this thing called McDonaldization. And he talked about efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. Efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. And what we can look at now, pretty much since 9/11, is that all 4 of those things are in free fall. They're all completely in free fall. It's very difficult now to find that sense of efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control, because there are so many of these events that we often term black swans. And of course, the black swan is it's a conventional term. Nicholas Nassim Taleb wrote a book on it in an economic context, but the term black swan is used in multiple disciplines, basically to refer to an event that we don't see coming, that defies our predictive models, it defies our expectations. And we can look at 9/11, we can look at Ebola in Africa, we can look at SARS in Southeast Asia, we can look at the dot-com boom or the global financial crisis in 2008, 9, 10. And of course, we can look at COVID-19. These are black swan events. And it's funny, I always wondered growing up why we chose black swans. And it turns out that where most of mainstream free market economics was happening in the North Atlantic, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, all the swans up that way are all white, right? So black swans are relatively rare. That's why they called them black swans. Now, funnily enough, I grew up in a little city in Australia called Perth on the west coast of Australia. And in Perth, we have tons and tons of swans. In fact, the river that runs through Perth is called the Swan River. And all the swans in Perth are black. We don't have white swans in Perth. So I just grew up with black swans. And so I was very confused studying economics and economic theory growing up, being taught the concept of the black swan. I found that very, very confusing because obviously in the Northern Hemisphere, most of the swans are white. So this idea of the black swan makes much more sense as something unusual. But the reality is that the Perth paradigm is much more accurate now than the rest of the world North Atlantic paradigm, because today almost every swan is black. There are black swans around every single corner. And it's almost not even worth using the term anymore because there's just so much unexpected stuff happening. And sure, we can talk about what's happened in US presidential politics. We can talk about the US-China trade war. We can talk about AI breakthroughs. We can talk about the big 5 tech companies that have just completely exploded in the last kind of 10 years. We can talk about 5G coming. We can talk about AI. We can talk about 9/11. We can talk about all this stuff that we didn't see coming. And now, of course, we have COVID-19. Like this ultimate black swan that's literally brought all of our global systems to a grinding halt, that's changed them pretty much irrevocably, that's shown that George Ritz's McDonaldization is pretty much done for the foreseeable future. There's no more predictability, there's no more calculability, there's no more control. And in the midst of that, the prevailing cultural paradigm of trying to predict the chaos or predict the storm or work out what's going to happen next is not particularly helpful, because what people now need are not better predictive models and algorithms, because the problem with predictive models and algorithms, and you guys are in politics, so there are predictive models when it comes to polling and political fortunes going up and down based on unemployment rates and interest rates and so forth. But The problem with predictive models and algorithms is that they are all based on data, and all data is based on the past. All data is based on the past necessarily. And the problem with all of this data is that none of it comes from the future, which is what we're trying to predict. So to an extent, we can see why we use the past, because the past is all we have. And in the past, models and algorithms and theories and isms of whatever kind are helpful in trying to work out what's going to happen in the future, but that's going to be less and less possible. The reality is we are going into storms that we just don't know what they're going to be like. We're taking on storms over the horizon and we just have no idea what they're going to look like. And what do human hearts, what do economies, what do public policy thinkers, what do politicians look for in the midst of that? Well, we don't look for predictive models anymore because that's not going to help us. We're all looking for two things. One is we are looking for anchors within the storm, anchors for our identity, anchors for our political parties, anchors for our outlooks on public policy and economics, anchors that hold in the midst of the storm. Because if you have a strong anchor, then it doesn't really matter how big the storm is. You're okay. But the anchor has to be transcendent. It has to be anchored outside of the storm. Anchors are completely useless unless they're attached to something outside of the storm, right? That's how an anchor works. Got to be attached to, the ocean floor or to land, right? There's no point even having a good anchor if it's still in the boat. So we need an anchor amidst the storm. The other thing we are looking for is for some kind of a transcendent frame that puts the storm in perspective. And this is where the storm in a teacup metaphor becomes helpful, right? Because storms in teacups are still storms, but we're much less fazed by them because we understand that they are in perspective. There's a much broader reality. There is a transcendent frame that makes the teacup not look like such a big deal. And we can deal with a storm in a teacup much more easily and with less fear than we can deal with, a storm in an ocean that we're in. So we're looking for an anchor, and we're looking for a transcendent frame to put the storm into perspective. So that's navigating instability. What about rethinking independence? Now, independence, once again, the prevailing cultural narrative is the millennial mantra. You do you, your best self, right? And this isn't new. Frank Sinatra was on about this years ago. The record shows I took the blows and did it my way. Pretty much this whole you do you thing that's come out of post-truth culture has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's a very intrinsic cry of the human heart that just wants to do what it wants to do. And so the idolization and deification of independence has accompanied that. But once again, what the pandemic has done is it's brought down our systems of independence. And it's proven that independence is a bit of a myth. And independence has lots of different synonyms. The psychologists and the psychiatrists call it self-actualization. The economists call it self-sufficiency, and the political scientists call it self-sufficiency. It's basically just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You do you. Work out who you are and pursue your own happiness, pursue your own success, pursue your own fulfillment. The problem that we have always had, but that is very obvious to us now with the pandemic, is that the you do you independence ideal, in its ultimate conception, it fails practically and it fails conceptually. It fails practically at the moment in a very obvious way because all of our systems through which we try and find independence as individuals, as families, as businesses, as countries, they've all come to a grinding halt. Whether it's our global trading system, our supply chains, our geopolitical system, our system of people movement and travel, it's all come to a grinding halt. So there's a failure there practically, but there's also a more important and lasting failure conceptually, because if we are building our identity on the idea of independence, and we say to ourselves, I'm not dependent on anyone financially, I'm financially independent, and we build our identity on that, all that has happened is that we have become dependent on the concept and ideal of financial independence. Right? Same goes for emotional. If people say, look, I am not dependent on anyone emotionally. I find emotional codependence very weak and naive and vulnerable, and I'm completely resilient and strong in myself. I'm emotionally independent. Well, that's all well and good. But if you build your identity and sense of who you are on that, then all you have done is shifted the goalpost. You're now simply dependent on the ideal of emotional independence. So what we see very clearly is that no matter what we do, we're all dependent on something. And there's a really interesting dialogue in one of the first Avengers movies. I think it's the one where Captain America becomes Captain America. And Loki, and those of you who follow Avengers, Loki is this kind of good guy, bad guy, no one really knows who he is guy. But in this particular movie, he's a bad guy. And he has come to Earth to subjugate all of humankind under him. And he makes them all kneel at gunpoint. And it's just like a huge group, massive people, like in Times Square or something in New York. And he says, the natural state of humankind is worship and subjugation. The natural state of humankind is worship. And you will all worship me. And then an old man stands up at the back of the group and he says, we will never worship you. And then Loki says, there has never been a man like me. And then the old man says, there have always been men like you. Now, that's interesting for a number of reasons. But the main reason I want to highlight it is because they have a huge disagreement, obviously, right? But no one at any point questions Loki's fundamental premise. The presupposition he starts with, which is the natural state of humankind is worship and subjugation. No one questions that. The guy accepts that. And that says something about the human heart. It's because he's absolutely right. And I've demonstrated it practically and conceptually. You don't need the Avengers for it. But what that actually highlights is that we are all dependent on something. We are deeply dependent beings. The only choice we get is what are we dependent on? So human beings are ultimately dependent. The question is, what people are looking for, the prevailing cultural paradigm will tell you what we're looking for is the means to independence, but that's not true. What we're actually looking for is something sufficiently strong and resilient that can take the weight of our dependence. We're actually looking for an object or subject that can take our dependence. We're looking for the most dependent being or thing we can possibly find, right? So that's how we need to rethink independence. Thirdly and finally, we need to build narratives through which we can deal with and help people deal with suffering, right? And there's a really famous novel which I hark back to a lot because it just demonstrates this reality of suffering really well. It's called Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, and she won a Pulitzer Prize for it. It's just really beautiful writing. And there's two really powerful sentences in that novel where she says, there are two realities that plague all of creation: my insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. And she just nails it with that, I think. What she's basically saying is, it doesn't matter what we do, how hard we try, how good we are, there's always something about me that doesn't feel quite right. At the same time, there's always something about the world that doesn't feel quite right. I'm always on some level imperfect, if I'm honest with myself, and the world around me is always on some level imperfect, if I'm honest with myself about my understanding of it. And that's increasingly obvious, sadly, for so many reasons, particularly in the political sphere. And because of those two realities, because we are broken and the world is broken, this intrinsic reality of suffering is completely unavoidable. And we know when we look at the various worldviews out there, the various narratives to deal with suffering, they don't quite cut it. There is one category of worldview, one worldview in particular, that says that suffering is real and there is a God out there, but he doesn't owe you anything morally. And so if you're suffering, that's just his will. He's all powerful. He's all sovereign. Just shut up and take it. There's another category of worldview that says that all suffering is karma. It's all your fault. Something you have done in this life, or perhaps a previous life, has brought on your suffering. Another category says that all suffering is an illusion. And so you've got to meditate yourself to a point of nothingness where you don't desire anything. Therefore, when you lose something, you won't suffer. Right? And then the fourth category, of course, are the atheistic worldviews, which say, when they're being honest, that suffering is meaningless. And they have to say that, because if atheism is being honest, then everything is meaningless, because we are just, as Richard Dawkins would say, time plus matter plus chance. There is no meaning. And so in the midst of all of that, what is the human heart looking for? The prevailing cultural narrative when it comes to suffering is to avoid the suffering, to try and navigate around it, to meditate yourself out of it, to get centered enough, to inoculate yourself against it with insurance or with relationships or with sex or with drugs or with Facebook friends or Instagram followers or with professional reputation or whatever it might be. But what are people actually looking for? People, I think, at a deep level understand that suffering is unavoidable, because I'm not good enough and the world is not good enough. It's going to be there. So what are the two things we're looking for? We are all looking for comfort and strength in the suffering, and a narrative of redemption that will take us beyond the suffering. comfort and strength within it, and a narrative of redemption beyond it. So when we think about these three things, navigating instability, rethinking independence as a concept, and dealing with suffering, what can we collate now about what the human heart is looking for, both at an individual level, but also what are countries and economies looking for? What are political systems and frameworks of public policy looking for? They're looking for the things that we've managed to put together now. When it comes to navigating instability, we're looking for an anchor in the storm, and we're looking for a transcendent frame through which to better understand the storm in its proper perspective. When it comes to rethinking independence, we're actually not looking for the means to independence. We're looking for something that is sufficiently dependable. And when it comes to dealing with suffering, we're not looking for a way to avoid it or dodge it. What we're actually looking for is comfort and strength within it, and a narrative of redemption that we can put our hope in beyond it. Now, the only thing that I haven't been truthful about so far in speaking to you guys is the quote on JFK's desk and Josiah Bartlett's desk in the West Wing. And it's not that I lied blatantly, but I missed out a part of the quote. I told you that the quote read, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." The quote actually reads, "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." And it's actually from a prayer. It's from a prayer from southern France during the Cold War that the French Navy used to use. And it was given as a gift by an admiral to JFK during the Cold War. "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." Because as soon as we bring God into the picture, as soon as we tag God into the picture, all of those things that the human heart and that our human systems and that our human economies and that our human frameworks of public discourse and public policy, all of those things that we've been looking for, find their responses and their fulfillment. We find an anchor in God himself through the person of Jesus Christ, an anchor for our identity outside of the storm. It doesn't make us immune to the storm, but it makes us immune to the ultimate damage of the storm. That's why in the Bible it's talked about as the valley of the shadow of death that we walk through. We still have to walk through it, but it's the valley of the shadow of death. And as I think it was Martin Luther wrote, you'd much rather be hit by the shadow of a horse and cart, or in today's parlance, you'd much rather be hit by the shadow of a truck than be hit by a truck, right? So there's an anchor outside of the storm. Also, there's a sense of perspective. There's a transcendent frame that relativizes the storm, right? That actually puts it in perspective, that this is not an eternal thing. There is actually a greater metaphysical reality that helps us put this storm in perspective so we're not consumed by it and destroyed by it. And when it comes to independence, we're looking for something ultimately dependable, and God himself has proven that he is trustworthy and worthy of our ultimate dependence. If we are fundamentally, intrinsically, and ultimately dependent beings, he is an eternally dependent God. Right? So he offers us that in response to our need for something dependable. And thirdly and finally, in our quest to find a way through suffering, through the cross of Jesus Christ, he offers us comfort and strength within the suffering as a God who actually literally stepped into our suffering for us and suffered for us. Now is willing to take our hands, if we give it to him, and suffer with us. He offers us comfort and strength in the suffering, and he offers us an eternal future beyond the suffering, where there will be no more suffering at all. So when we understand that it's God's sea and our boat is small, but we have a God who is willing to step into the boat with us. He is willing to step into the boat with us. And that's the most powerful part about that story, that account of Jesus in the storm with his disciples. The great irony of that story is that the disciples thought that the problem was that Jesus was asleep in the boat. But the great irony of the whole thing was that they were not awake to the reality of who he was. They're the ones that were asleep. They thought the problem was that he was asleep. The problem was that they were asleep to who he was. And that is the challenge for us today. It's actually a challenge in some ways for both Christians and for non-Christians. But the challenge is, are we awake to the reality of who Jesus is and how he satisfies and fulfills the needs of the marketplace out there and the needs of the marketplace in here? And I'm not here, making a case for theocracy or anything like that. But what I'm saying is that this person, Jesus Christ, through his cross and by his message, offers us satisfactory and compelling solutions, both conceptually and practically, for what the marketplace out there and the marketplace in here is looking for. Oh God, your sea is so big and our boats are so small. But because you're willing to step into our boats, we know that when we invite you in and the storm continues, one of two things is going to happen sooner or later. Either God is going to calm the storm, or the storm is going to continue to swirl and he's going to calm us in the storm. That's the promise of the Christian message. God guarantees one of two things will happen. He will either calm the storm, or the storm will continue and he will calm us within the storm. Thanks so much for giving me a hearing. Thanks so much for taking time and being flexible on the timing. Look forward to taking a few of your questions. Back over to you, Jesus.
All right, thank you very much, Max. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a private message. I would more than happy to pass it along to Max, and we'll see. Give him his answer. He'll give us his answers. We have a couple questions already. They're pretty. You talked about a lot of different topics, so they're pretty spread out on all your different topics. But one question is, what are some of the practical practices you employ to help yourself anchor yourself amidst the storms of uncertainty?
Yeah, great question. You know, it's interesting. Like when Jesus was literally asked by an expert in the law, I always have a bit of a chip on my shoulder that God chose a lawyer to really smack down to make this point. But so this lawyer goes to Jesus and basically doesn't quite ask that question, but asks the more upstream question, like, what am I meant to do? What's the greatest commandment? You know, what's the one thing I need to do in order to, you know, get to heaven or to find fulfillment or to flourish? He asks an instructional question, right? He's asking for an instruction. And what Jesus does is he turns the question on its head and very subtly doesn't answer it. He answers a different question, or at least he answers it in a different way. The lawyer asks for an instruction. Instead, Jesus answers with two sets of relationship. And I think those two sets of relationship are the things that we need to focus on every day. So this lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what am I meant to do? Like, what's the to-do list? What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, go and love God and love other people. So what he's basically saying is, every day when you wake up, these are the two categories of relationship that need to be the first two priorities in your life. The investment that you make in your relationship with God, and the investment that you make in your relationships with the people around you. Your family, your spouse, if you have one, your kids, if you've got them, your friends, your colleagues, your colleagues that hate you, your colleagues that love you, your neighbors in a literal sense, your neighbors in a metaphorical sense, basically everyone in your sphere of connection and community, you know, in your world. Love God and love them. And so I think what I would suggest is to build your daily habits and routines around those two categories of relationship, because they point to what God is. God literally, when he comes into the world as a person and is asked that question, that's what he says. He says, if you focus on these two relationships, these two categories, everything else will fall into place. Everything else will fall into place. And so I think obviously that means time daily with God, which I know can be tough. And man, I remember working as a staffer, especially later on when I was a little more senior, where there's just no time, right? Where you're just up at like 4:30 in the morning and you're getting media briefings, and you know the media advisors are grumpy because they've been up since 3:30 in the morning. I don't know how many of you are in the media and comms units, but it's just a madhouse. If politics is working well, it's a frenzy, right? But even in the midst of that, to just carve out time to spend with God, one-on-one, even if it's, if it's a really rough day, even if it's just 10 or 15 minutes, but ideally, 30 minutes, 1 hour, if you can manage it, time with God. And then I think secondly, time with people. I don't think, it's not that I don't think it, the Bible is very clear that life, let alone the Christian life, was just not designed to be lived alone. It's meant to be lived in community, for people to support us, to get alongside people who are running the race in the direction that we are running it, and so to invest in those relationships. So I hope that's helpful. I don't want to get too practical and just say here are the 5 things, but I think time with God and time with others, and that can be done in many different ways, in many different through many different habits, I think. But yeah, those are 2 broad purposes that I think should help.
Thank you. That actually kind of leads into the next question. Obviously, as we've expressed your experience in the Australian Parliament, you know what partisanship is, and how there's an aisle and you can't really cross the aisle. Can you talk about your experience with that? And did you find you were able to make real connections with people across the aisle in terms of, to your second, not to the second point, but to the second point of Jesus loving people? Were you able to, can you speak to that?
Yeah, look, it's so tough, and I totally recognize how tough it is. And politics in in Western democracies like Canada and Australia, uh, and of course the United States and the United Kingdom even more so, has just gotten more hostile and more divided and more partisan over the last 10 or 15 years. I went into professional politics in 2007, and I left it in 2013. And even in those 7 years, uh, it had changed significantly, and it's gotten substantially worse since then. Um, Thankfully, the government that I worked for, the second one, we won an election. We won the first one, then we won another election by, almost with no majority. And in that government, we had to work a lot with coalition partners, so with minority parties and with independents as well. And that was actually really good for partisanship. We even had to work with the opposition because sometimes the minority parties and the independents wouldn't come with us. And so, funnily enough, I think about 1/3 of our legislative agenda we passed with the support of the opposition. And I'm not saying, I'm not advocating necessarily for um, parliaments of coalitions or multiple coalitions. I think Europe has far too many bad examples of why that doesn't work well. I tend to prefer the English, Canadian, Australian paradigm where you have a very small number of major parties, like two or three, and government switches like every 5 to 10 years between the two. So you have stability, and both parties govern from the centre with a flank of their wing. So the Conservatives govern from the centre right and the Progressives govern from the centre left. Sad thing about the partisanship in the last 15 years is that both parties have just run, in some senses, to their wings, which has good and bad, but it's definitely bad for the level and tone of public discourse and partisanship. As a Christian, one thing that we bring to the table is this conception of objective human dignity, which no other worldview has. Literally no other worldview has it, because it arises out of the Imago Dei, the fact that we're all made in the image of God. And that is, that's what actually gave rise to the concept of democracy in the first place. Universal suffrage, human rights, labor laws, child labor laws, education, mandatory education standards. It all came out of the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei. You don't need too much of a history lesson to track that. And because of that, we are actually more intellectually and philosophically equipped than people of any other worldview to make the case for partisanship. But I don't think democracies are really about finding common ground. I know there's a lot of talk about we need to find common ground, we need to get together. Well, once too many political parties start getting together, then democracy dies because you're not offering, different things. So my encouragement to political leaders, and the ones I'm still in touch with, is, don't try and find common ground with your political opponents and enemies. That ruins the choice of the people. You actually have to offer something very different, and that's what elections are about. But what we can do is reach across the aisle personally, and that is difficult. And some of you might respond that that's not even possible because there's that much hostility. But we actually were able to build what I would like to consider, friendships with people on the other side. I was a social policy advisor, and so there was a guy in the opposition, the shadow cabinet, one of the political and policy advisors there in, my minister's counterpart in shadow cabinet, whom I just struck up a bit of a, healthy, enemy rapport with. And we would, very occasionally just go out for a beer. I'd loop him in on things that I needed, opposition support for, very rarely on occasions. And we just found that, we're going through similar things. Relationally with our friends, we have similar amounts of sleep deprivation. We have a similar passion for politics. We're both watching The West Wing. It's funny how much you have in common personally with people, that, hate your guts politically. I know that's a big ask, but I really encourage people to try and do that. And I think as Christians, we have the artillery to do it because we understand that people are bearing the image of God. And so one thing we can try and do is to outlove people. And the reason we can do that is because we are playing with supernatural love. So the world might find that impossible, but I think we can transcend that, and to actually not necessarily find common political ground, because we might just disagree on stuff politically, and that's fine. But to have a drink with someone that you fundamentally disagree with politically and not try and change their mind, but just to try and engage with them as a human, I think that's a lost art. And they've pretty much lost it completely almost in the United States and the United Kingdom. I think there's a bit of hope left in Canada and Australia. If you think about the democracies that emerged from the North Atlantic and from Latin Christendom, philosophically, if you'd like. So that might be overly hopeful from a guy that hasn't been in professional politics for a few years now, but that'd be my hope and my advice, if you can manage it.
Pretty early in on your speech, you talked about the McDonification. I don't know if I'm using that word correctly. Of
McDonaldization. Yeah,
McDonaldsization. Do you see that there's that in McDonaldization in the church? Is it a good thing? And what are some potential solutions?
Yeah, totally. It's totally in the church. I think you find it whenever there are people putting together anything. So. The guy that started Subway, the guy that started this church or that church, all the way through to the guy that started this company or that company, whether it's a tech startup or a political party or a church. As soon as people have new ideas and their creative juices are flowing, but they latch onto something that actually takes hold in terms of consumer demand or success, people very quickly will pivot to regularity and predictability. Now, in the church, there are elements of that are really important. When it comes to things like what we hold to be true, doctrine, our beliefs, you want to be anchored. You want predictability, calculability, and repeatability, and that's a healthy thing. But one thing I think the pandemic has done is that beyond that, in churches, we really do need to be thinking innovatively and thinking outside of the box. And I think it was very early on in the pandemic in The Economist, there was a CEO, I think he was the CEO of Unilever. He says, we have to get agile, we have to get responsive, and we have to get adaptive quickly. And if you don't like any of those things, then you're really going to hate irrelevance, because that's what comes next. And so the churches that I see that have done really well and that are doing well in the pandemic are churches that have remembered whom they worship and remembered what they believe, but everything else is pretty much up for grabs. They have innovated, they've tried new things, they've done stuff midweek. They haven't just taken everything they did on a Sunday morning and just gone Control C, Control V on Zoom, right? I think when you Control C, Control V anything for too long, you cripple your capacity to innovate. And political parties have that problem sometimes. And the party I was working for was in opposition for a long time because we weren't learning from our losses. We weren't learning from our mistakes. And part of that is just an incapacity to innovate and adapt. So there's always a risk in any bureaucracy, including churches. And so I think we do need to constantly be on the lookout for how can we be doing things better, or perhaps even can we be doing things better? And the answer might be no. But to continue to ask the question, I think, is important. And there's no worse reason to do something in a certain way than, well, that's how we've always done it. I think that's a deeply problematic thing, especially given how quickly the world is changing. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I think this will be our final question, and I think part of it is on my part not introducing you properly. But can you share us your journey, how you came to faith, and how is it that you transitioned from working in economic politics to being an apologist?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try not to take too long. I'll give you the shortened version. But my parents were both very much in love with Jesus, and he was very much a part of our family growing up. But I didn't make a decision to invite him into my life until I was 15. So he was kind of in the room, but I ignored him a lot. But the message of Jesus, the gospel, always had credibility for me just because of the love I had for my parents and the respect I had for them. But it didn't become real for me until I was 15. And then, to be honest, between the ages of 15 and probably 22, I backslid a lot. I did a lot of stupid things, made a lot of stupid decisions. I still, when I look back on those years, I see God's fingerprints all over them. but I wasn't really pulling my weight. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s and actually practicing law and then started working in politics where my faith came back to life. The questions I had, I discovered this thing called apologetics, this substream of theology for Christians who want to think. And I just didn't think that community was out there. I didn't think that existed. And so that completely blew my mind. And that's when I actually realized, wow, this thing's not just nice. It's literally true. It's literally true. And so that was a game changer for me. And I was actually really enjoying politics, when I left it. To be honest, I was dragged away from it kicking and screaming. I really loved it. And, in some ways, a few people were saying that I was being groomed for a seat for pre-selection. The leader of the opposition whom I worked, he was tipped to become prime minister. He went on to lose 2 elections, and that was it. And so my story is that that's because I left his office. But there were many other factors at play. But politics was my life. I loved it. I lived it. I breathed it, and I was all set. But my wife made a really good point. She said, "I worry that if we don't mix it up a little bit, that we might miss out on something else that the Lord might have for us. So why don't we just take a year, and then we'll come back." And so my boss was really great. He offered me 1 year of leave without pay. He said, "Just come back after the next election." And we'll see. And so we just started praying about opportunities to study. And I was quite happy to just, sightsee and backpack, for a year. But I applied to this center, which is known as OCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which I'd been told after a lot of research was the best place in the world to study apologetics. And the best fit for me as someone who was a lawyer in litigation, as a trial lawyer, and then, in professional politics. I enjoyed a contested space, but I was very weak theologically. I didn't really know how to read the Bible, didn't know how to spell theology, didn't know how to spell God at that time. So I needed a bit of grounding. And yeah, by God's grace, got a scholarship, got admitted. And so we went to Oxford for what was meant to be 9 months. We backpacked around Europe for 3 months. And then wound up in Oxford. And then, long story short, my wife got a great job. I met some amazing people through this program, and got tapped on the shoulder, by Ravi Zacharias and a few other people that said, "Look, we discern that there might be something here. We might be wrong. You might be crazy and no good, but why don't we just journey together for another year and see how it works out?" And so we stayed for a second year, and then, he invited me to join his speaking team. And then offered me this role in Singapore. And so that's what kind of got me here. So I still haven't really made the decision to leave professional politics. It's just that the currents of God's plan have kind of taken me here. Deep down, I do ask him every now and then whether maybe I could get back to it one day, but you never know. You never know what he's going to do. But I'm very blessed to be doing what I do now. I really enjoy it. I get the opportunity to, meet with groups of folks like yourselves. And I find the intersection of faith and politics actually much more stimulating and gratifying than perhaps some aspects of full-time politics, which I was in before. But you're all so blessed to be working where you're working. Please enjoy it. Please don't be disheartened by how toxic the discourse is. Just remember that you march to the beat of a different drummer, that you serve a God whose ways are higher than the ways of not just professional politics, but the world. But yeah, that's just a bit about my story. Thanks for asking.
Oh, no problem. And it's clearly evident that you still very much love politics from your speech and how well you keep up to date with everything that's going on in the world. You have 2 minutes. You seem like an avid reader. Do you have any book recommendations for Christian leaders in these spheres?
Yeah, there's actually a great book that I read it, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, and it's by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's just a fantastic historian. And it's called Leadership in Turbulent Times. And she basically does a leadership deconstruction of what she considers to be the 5 most interesting US presidents. One of whom is Lyndon Baines Johnson, whom she worked for. But I think that book at a time like this, is very, very useful. So I can certainly recommend that. And then I mean, I know in politics, you guys are all reading just tons of nonfiction all the time. You're reading political stuff, you're reading The Economist, you're reading The Atlantic, you're reading Tim Keller, you're reading Ravi Zacharias, you're reading all the usual suspects. I just really encourage you to read some fiction. I call them cheeseburgers. Find the kind of cheeseburger novels that are just, big words, big font, big margins on the page, easy to read, that you enjoy, whether it's, John Grisham, or Jeffrey Archer, stuff that's just never going to win a Nobel Prize. It's never going to win a Booker. It's never going to make a bestseller list amongst the sophisticated intelligentsia, but it's just easy to read. I feel like one mistake I made in politics was I just read way too much nonfiction. You've just got to engage the creative parts of your brain a little bit more. Otherwise, you can just, get chewed up by the sterility of quantitative models and political theories and political analysts. So I'll make the Doris Kearns Goodwin plug, but then encourage you to find some cheeseburgers and read some cheeseburgers.
Awesome. Thanks for the advice. I might eat some cheeseburgers as well.
Please do. Please do.
That will be our time for today. Thank you for everybody who joined us on the call. Next week, we're back to our normal allotted schedule at noon. And we're going to have Abdu Mori come speak to us. But again, thank you very much, Max. It was very great lesson and speech you gave us. And yeah, it was very great. And I hope to pick your brain on politics in the future if I can.
Sure. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. God bless you guys.
Oh, thank you. And everybody, thank you. And have a good rest of your work day. Now you can go take an early lunch. All right. Bye.
Thanks, Max.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jesus.
No problem.